Cathie, we're talking this month particularly about persecution and in the Australian context. And I'm interested to know, how do church wives feel persecution in their community?
Yeah. I actually asked this question of the Geneva Wives on Facebook, and there is a lot of feeling about persecution. People do experience it to a degree. It's quite subtle kinds of persecution. It's not your life is taken from you. So it's an interesting thing. And sometimes I think it's hard to know if it's because of your Christian conviction or if it's not so much persecution as just someone may not like you and you happen to be Christian. So I think there's that grey area in it. But some of the things people were mentioning were being shunned from conversations or conversations shutting down once you get into an area of Christianity. I guess being not part of peer groups, so school mums doing things, but you're left out of those invites. So those kinds of things, but you can never be sure, is that because I'm Christian or they just don't like me? So it's one of those hard things. I had one personal example where I was never quite sure if it was because I was Christian or not, but the class that my daughter was in had to become a composite, but not entirely. Only 2 children had to go into the composite class. The rest of the class went as a group. And the 2 kids they decided to put in the composite were mine and another Christian parent's daughter. So these 2 girls were put into a class lower than their age group while the rest of the group went on. So it was a really difficult year for them. And we were never sure, how much fuss to make about it. So it was one of those awkward things. So I think a lot of them are subtle like that. You're not quite sure what's going on. Some are more blatant. So I know at the school that my kids were at, Scripture was put on always in the morning time slot, which was quite a good time slot. And then with a change of principle, the Scripture was straight away moved to the last lesson on Friday, which, as every person knows, is the absolute worst time to try and get kids to listen. So that was less subtle. And just little things like ethics got a lot of advertising, which it actually wasn't meant to do. And it helped that our children's worker knew a lot of the rules about Scripture. Otherwise, a lot of things would have just been pushed and slid under. At high school, we used to do this thing called Chips and Jesus, which engaged 120 kids would come to a lunchtime group where, yes, you get chips and hang around and listen to a talk. And then a new principal arrived and decided to can chips because they were unhealthy. So we weren't allowed to do chips. So it became sandwiches and Jesus or something like that. I forget. Nothing is as great as chips and Jesus. And then decided to bring in a ruling that you had to have a note to be able to go. So what high school kid is ever going to go and ask their parents for a note to go? So the numbers went from 120 down to 30 almost overnight. So those things are going on all the time. And I think they're persecution. I think you do need to always ask yourself, is it because of me? Is it something I've done? Am I being offensive to people? Or is it purely my Christian convictions? And it does take a bit of a thick skin. I remember not being very good at this. And when I was aware I was invited to things, I'd be very, very upset, which I think that's understandable to some extent. But I think it's good if we can be someone who's a giver to others and can maintain that sense of security in Jesus, so that when we're in those situations where you may be aware that you're being slighted or whatever, you just continue to be kind and generous and give and look for the other person who may be being left out or whatever and give to them. And I wish I'd been more of that. And I think that actually is really helpful. I do say, I've said this before, I think, in another webinar, but some of the same people that I got left out from when our kids were in kindy are around now, and they're very warm towards me. And I have no idea why, because they weren't particularly back then. But I bumped into one in the shops recently, and she was like, let's have a coffee. And this month we're having some talks at our church that will be good for people who are not used to coming to church. And so I texted her and invited her to one, and she was like, thank you for thinking of me. I'd love to come to one. And so I'm hoping she'll come to one of the talks this month. I don't get how that's happened, but yeah, one of the things that I think is just hang in there, be a giver, be warm to people, and if you can just stick in there for the long run, I know it may turn around. You may become a person that they're attracted to and want, some kind of relationship with you and find out what you've got. I don't know.